I'm sharing my screen. It's okay? So I would like to start by warmly thanking the Center for Fine Arts BOZAR for welcoming this online conference. And my thanks in particular to its director, Paul Dujardin, but also to Ana Maria Pazmino and Olga Briard for the practical and technical organization of this conference. Ingrid Falk and myself from the Center for Early Model Cultural Analysis, the GEMCA, at the Université Catholique de Louvain, have been invited by BOZAR to co-organize this one-day conference, a conference which should have taken place in Brussels in close connection with the exhibition Facing Van Eyck. It would have been a greater pleasure to welcoming you all in the Center for Fine Arts, giving you also the opportunity to visit this wonderful exhibition. But as we say in French, il faut faire contre mauvaise fortune bon cœur. This means that we make the best out of the bad situation and capitalize on some advantages. Indeed, this online conference gives us the opportunity to gather a very large and international audience that we greet and thank for their virtual presence. I would now like to highlight the fact that this conference is the continuation of a series of previous scientific encounters launched by BOZAR, starting 5 years ago with the Symposium Path to Europe, under the scientific supervision of Bernard Coulis, who is present in the audience today. This event was already sponsored by the Leventis Foundation, that I would like also to thank for their support. And this symposium was then related to the exhibition Painting from Siena in BOZAR. And I'm really recommending you the proceedings of this symposium on your left, as well as the catalog of the exhibition on your right. Our today's symposium follows in the footsteps of this previous conference with the aim of broadening the chronological and geographical scopes. The 2015 conference questioned the influence and contacts between Byzantium and the Low Countries, especially during the late Middle Ages. This morning session will come back to this very important moment and issue, and I will let in a few minutes Ingrid Falk introduce this session. In a more general perspective, I would like to recall that the art of the icon, a visual idiom born in the Eastern Church, either deeply imbued or influence superficially the visual creation of the Western world. This presence of the art of the icon manifested itself despite the adoption during the Renaissance of an aesthetic that was elaborated in opposition to the maniera greca, as it was qualified, or rather disqualified, by humanists of the Renaissance such as Giorgio Vasari. Even though artistic modernity was built against this art, considered as awkward, goffa in Italian, it did not prevent the Byzantine style to surface several times in Western art history. These revivals function both as an antidote against the excesses of what was perceived as a cult of art for art's sake, and as a way of recharging oneself with religious ideals considered more pure. This symposium aims to question the reason of the survival or the revivals of this art coming from elsewhere in distinct artistic landscapes. Another worldliness experienced both as temporal, Middle Ages, and geographical, Orient. In a transperiodic perspective, the afternoon session will focus on the study of two key moments in this long history. First, the early modern period, which gave rise to a first form of Gothic revival through the promotion of pseudo-Byzantine images deemed miraculous, which themselves inspired some artistic productions. Unfortunately, I have to announce that Christopher Nygren will not be able to join us today and present this afternoon his research on Titian, but I'm really recommending you his book on the topic, Titian's icons. The second key moment is the 19th and 20th century. During these 2 centuries, and certainly after the Second Vatican Council, the fashion emerged in the Catholic Church for an art of the icon deemed more authentic against what is perceived as a classical academicism having lost any spiritual dimension. Through this dialogue between the West and the East, a dialogue that often turns into a fantasized vision of the former with regard to the latter, it will be necessary to question not only the meeting of 2 visual cultures, but also the complex relationships between art and religion, or more precisely, the problematic reconciliation between the aims of the one and those of the other. And I will now leave the floor to Ingrid.
Thank you, Ralph. So, as Ralph just told us, today's symposium is in the line of the Path to Europe conference, which was dedicated to the influence of Byzantine icons on the late medieval and Renaissance Western art and culture. This conference more precisely focused on the ways in which icons were then disseminated in Western Europe at this time. From where did they come from, and to where and how did they penetrate Western cultural and artistic worlds? The Path to Europe conference had as its main focus the Low Countries, that is a region for which such question still needed answers, whereas the issue of dissemination of icons in Italy was then much more studied. Today, we would like to expand these questions by approaching them in the longue durée, as Ralph explained, but also by broadening the issue of dissemination and influence. More precisely, our speakers will focus on the various ranges of the resurgence of icons in Western art and culture, from the Renaissance to the present day. We will not only focus on how they arrived and were welcome in Western Europe, but also on how they have been seen, understood, reworked, transformed, adapted, and even deformed from a formal, iconographical, and functional point of view. In other words, how did and how do Western artists and beholders perceive this specific type of images? The starting point of today's investigation will be the 15th century. That is a pivotal time in the history of the relations between East and West, but also a crucial moment for the encounter between Byzantine and Western visual cultures. And in some cases, the merging on synthesis, as we will see with several papers today. In order to get smoothly to the heart of our matter, and as a way to introduce you to the topic, let me briefly present to you 2 case studies analyzed in previous publications. There is no need to state again that the presence of Byzantine icons in Western Europe and their influence on Western art during the Renaissance is well documented. I won't dwell here on their formal and iconographical impact on European painting, but rather on the ways icons were seen and used, and also on the way they shaped the beholder's gaze and uses of Western images derived from them. For this lies at the core of our speakers' interventions for later period as well. By doing so, I hope to illustrate in a schematic way and a brief way the richness and diversity of the icon's influence on Western visual culture. In a few minutes, Till-Holger Borchert and Catherine Lichtert will discuss how Byzantine icons were perceived and worshipped as cult images in the 15th century Low Countries, and how images were adapted by Flemish artists in order to meet the devotional practices of their patrons. Ralph, can you switch the slide, please? One of the most famous examples of this phenomenon is the Notre de Gras of Cambrai, an Italo-Byzantine icon of the Virgin and Child dated from around 1340 that was considered as a miraculous image in the 15th century. The painting arrived from Rome in Cambrai in 1440 as an authentic portrait of the Virgin and painted by Saint Luke, and rapidly became highly venerated. The success of this cult image is attested by numerous copies produced by numerous Flemish painters. In 1454, Petrus Christus executed 3 copies, while the painter N. de Bruxelles copied the icon no more than 12 times. Many of these 15th century copies are lost, but some of them have been preserved, and it enables us to notice that they are not faithful copies, but rather that the Flemish artist actualized the composition in order to insist on the affective relationship between the Virgin and her Son. Such a phenomenon, copying a cult image, is not an isolated case. As Hans Belting has shown, replicas of such miraculous images were perceived as witnesses to the original image and were therefore invested with the same miraculous powers as their models. Next slide. This obviously explained the success in the longue durée of miraculous images such as Notre de Gras of Cambrai, which has also been copied quite intensively in the 16th and 17th century by local artists with various degrees of faithful imitation, as Ralph showed during the Past to Europe conference. As recent research has shown, icons were also collected as art objects in the 15th century and were thus appreciated for their aesthetic value. This is notably the case of the Medici. Next slide, please. The Bargello Museum hosts today a Byzantine miniature mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, dated from the 3rd quarter of the 12th century, and that belonged to that collection of the Medici, next to Renaissance paintings, sculptures, and antique objects. It took a very long time for scholars to acknowledge that the protagonist of the Italian Renaissance could have developed a real taste for Byzantine icons. Nonetheless, in the 15th century, the Medici art collection counted no less than 17 icons. A study of the inventories showed that many of them entered the collection not as gifts or by inheritance, but because the members of the family deliberately acquired them and to form a collection of icons. What was then the value and significance of these Byzantine icons for the Medici? Were they perceived as antiquities, as Alexander Nagel and Christopher Wood suggested? Based on historical evidence, Rembrandt Duits has argued recently that these icons were collected by the Medici by taste. Thanks to the 1492 inventory of the Medici goods, which lists artworks room by room and give therefore hints to their function within the household, we know where these icons were displayed. Most of them were kept in the study room, the scrittoio of Lorenzo the Magnificent, which was the treasure room, preserving the most valuable objects of the family, and notably the foreign works of art. The icons therefore had a certain status in the collection. 3 of the 17 icons were also kept in Lorenzo's and his son's camera, that is the bedroom used for private devotion, and which was also used to receive guests in an intimate setting. Works of art kept there were thus meant to be seen by an external audience. The Bargello icon were kept in Lorenzo's camera and was associated to other mosaic images produced by Florentine artists in order to match it, as Rembrandt Duits argues. Its presence in this private but yet public room is thus a hint to the personal value this icon had for Lorenzo, a value that is at the same time devotional and aesthetic. Most of the Medici icons are now lost, but we nonetheless know that in the late 16th century, the Bargello icon was displayed in the tribuna of the Uffizi Gallery, as testified in an inventory of 1589. Interestingly, this room was hosting the most prestigious pieces of the Uffizi collection, therefore indicating that at this time, an artistic value was still granted to Byzantine icons in Florence. And later today, we'll see that it's also the case in other places. Time is running, so I won't dwell any longer on this, but before giving virtually the floor to our speakers and begin this morning's session, let me please share with you a few practical points. The audience is large today, and it's a really good thing. So we kindly ask you to keep your camera and microphones switched off during the sessions. Each paper will last 20 minutes and will be followed by a 10 minutes discussion and time for questions. After each talk, you will therefore be able to address your questions and remarks in writing them in the Q&R tool, question and answer tool, therefore not via the conversation tool, which is dedicated to practical issues. And Ralph and I, as moderators, will then ask the question orally to our speakers. And we thank you in advance for your attention and interest in the papers. So I will now present our first speaker of today, Till Holger Borchert, who is an art historian and writer. He is currently the director of the Musea Bruges, and before that he has been chief curator of the Groningen Museum and the Arenshuis in Bruges too. He has been teaching in Europe and in the US and has created a huge number of major exhibitions, including Memling's portraits, which was shown in Bruges, at the Frick Collection in New York, and at the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid. And most recently, he also co-curated the famous, and unfortunately very too brief for me because I didn't see it, so the exhibition, the retrospective on Van Eyck, an optical revolution, at the Museum of Fine Arts in Ghent. He has published numerous books, exhibition catalogues, and articles on Netherlandish art, among which Splendor of the Burgundian Court, Charles the Bold, in 2009, and also, for example, Van Eyck to Dürer, the influence of Netherlandish painting on European art, in 2011. And he will not, today speak about the Van Eyck, the Facing Van Eyck exhibition with a paper entitled Icons and the Politics of Miracle. Till, the floor is up to you.
Of course, you can't see my screen, right? Can you see it now?
Yes.
Now we do.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank my colleagues and friends at BOZAR for the opportunity to present here a small paper. And also to you guys at the university at GEMCA to organize this symposium. As Paul has said before, the idea was actually that we would have had not only a live conference now, but also an exhibition that would sort of highlight the influence of Byzantine, of the reciprocal influence of Byzantine and Netherlandish painting, which of course has not been possible because of the pandemic. Nonetheless, we do have a wonderful exhibition that Bart Fransen and the colleagues of the KKOP have put up from the Van Eyck research and open access material that has been gathered over the last 5-6 years, and to which Bruges and its Flemish Research Center of the Arts in the Burgundian Netherlands had been contributing, not only in kind, but also financially, so that the results would be available online. I have spoken at the last symposium, as did Ralph and Catherine as well, here at BOZAR, the proceedings which have been published under the title The Path of Europe. And as I kind of don't like to repeat myself, I have slightly shifted the focus of this paper to probably interesting question that looks at the possible political motivation after sort of like promoting these images. Of course, if we are talking about the reception of Byzantine art in the West, much of what we are discussing here wouldn't be said without the fundamental research that has been carried out by Hans Belting, and in the slipstream of Belting by Gerhard Wolf of the Florentine Institute. Of course, it's needless to say that their publications on Bild und Kult by Belting and Schleier, I forgot the title, by Gerhard, are fundamental publications that is compulsory reading in my point of view. Now, let me get to Van Eyck. Van Eyck's paintings, it has once more become obvious earlier this year during the Van Eyck exhibitions in Bruges and Ghent, have not ceased to fascinate their viewers. His works are extremely rare. Just more than a handful of panels have survived. They are genuinely admired by today's public because of the extraordinary technical skills with which they are painted. And Jan van Eyck seems to make a point in his paintings to ostentatiously rub these technical abilities into our faces. And you can actually see that very well in the exhibition at BOZAR, because that is yet another experience than looking at these things at a high resolution screen. Van Eyck's legendary skills enabled him to depict his subjects with unprecedented realism. His contemporaries, especially the humanists at the Italian courts and collectors like the Medici, valued his work as highly as those of antiquity and kept them alongside those masterpieces of the past. They clearly understood that Van Eyck didn't have the privilege of studying antiquity, therefore he mimetically had to emulate nature itself, while his counterparts south of the Alps, like Masaccio, approached verisimilitude of nature in an indirect manner that was mediated by the work of the great masters from antiquity. It is hardly an exaggeration if we claim that in his paintings, Jan van Eyck laid the foundations of our contemporary understanding of realism in art, as his works answer to this day to our perception of realism as we know it. Today, we perceive paintings by even the best masters of the preceding generations as symbolic, but when looking at Van Eyck's Virgin of Chancellorsville, for example, today at the Musée du Louvre, we recognize the details of the landscapes and wouldn't be surprised if we encountered the Burgundian Chancellor in the street, or perhaps more likely on a film set. The illusionistic qualities, the ostentatious realism, the fascinating technique, these aspects of the art of Van Eyck tend to overshadow the fact that his paintings are deeply symbolic nonetheless. These symbolic qualities of his works have been subject to controversies among art historians since Erwin Panofsky's pivotal interpretation published in 1934 in the Burlington magazines of what the author saw to be the wedding portrait of Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife, Giovanna Cenami. In this article, based on early observations by Panofsky himself, put forward in a Vorlesung at the University of Hamburg in 1928, of which a transcript survives, and research of the Hungarian art historian Karl von Tolnay, or as he is sometimes known, Charles de Tonnay, he revealed the disguised symbolism of seemingly everyday objects shown by the painter in his famous composition, and argued that the painting was a painted document witnessing the holy sacrament of marriage spent by the groom and bride. And I think I can sort of like quickly, do you actually see my cursor moving? Good. So you have here an inscription, Jan van Eyck Fuetik. You have here a depiction of a mirror image where two people enter through the doorway. And, the idea of Panofsky was that this would actually sort of like constitute witnesses to a legal or, sacramental act, an act that became compulsory to be registered at church only after the Council of Trient. And that, for example, here, this burning candle would be a bridal candle, and refer to the wedding. And so every object in this painting, he kind of linked to the further of the idea of a marriage. Panofsky's concept of disguised symbolism served for some decades as a quasi-doctrinal manner among scholars to interpret and to understand earlier than his paintings, until the very core of it was challenged by a new generation of art historians who took, excuse my pun, linguistic turns against Panofsky's historical doctrine. I call these arguments linguistic because they didn't question the symbolic character of the paintings of Van Eyck and his contemporaries, but rather questioned the degrees of the disguise in which the symbolic objects were presented pictorial, or challenging the rigid objectivity with which Panofsky's methods of interpretation was used to provide an illusion of understanding. More concise historical research provided better insights into the function or the patterns of these works, and, in the case of the aforementioned Arnolfini wedding, made clear beyond a doubt that Panofsky's interpretation, however congenial, had to be wrong, for there were two members of the Arnolfini family in Bruges, called Giovanni at that time, neither of them was married in 1434. So it couldn't possibly be Giovanni Arnolfini and his wife Giovanna Cenami, and it couldn't possibly be a record of a wedding ceremony. Nonetheless, there can't be any doubt about the fact that Van Eyck did not depict nature or portrayed real events. Instead, he constructed in his religious paintings a transcendental reality well beyond the reality of nature, based on the transcendental qualities of figures and objects that he depicted. Let us briefly turn to the Virgin of Canon van der Pale, which Van Eyck painted in Bruges between 1434 and 1436, and which was commissioned to be displayed in the chapter church of Saint Donation. Saint Donation was among the most prominent churches in the Low Countries. It was not an episcopal cathedral, but it was the committal church of the Counts of Flanders. The provost of Saint Donation's chapter traditionally served as Chancellor of Flanders. In Burgundian times, it was the church of the great Dukes of Burgundy in Bruges. Joris van der Pale commissioned the painting. He was a cleric who had made an impressive career at various papal courts during the conciliarian period of the schism of the church during the first decades of the 15th century. During his tenure in the papal curia under several popes and anti-popes, he was clearly shifting his alliances and thus became able to systematically amass a great deal of wealth linked to fixed income from ecclesiastical offices and property. His wealth, experience, and ecclesiastical network made the elderly cleric apply for the vacant position of a canon at the chapter of Saint Donation in his hometown of Bruges at the end of a career, which was among the richest chapters in the Low Countries. When he fell ill in 1434 and feared to die soon, he made an enormous financial contribution to made a foundation of masses, as part of which he commissioned, nonetheless, Jan van Eyck, the court painter of Philip the Good, and certainly a celebrity at his time, to paint an epitaph that also seemed to have served as an altarpiece during the celebration of memorial masses. Van Eyck represented the elderly canon in front of the altar in an ecclesiastical building that resembled the Carolingian parts of the church in Bruges. And that, of course, again, which is now shown at the presentation at the Ghent University Museum, that in itself sort of assembled or depicted actually a part of not only the sepulchre in Jerusalem, but also the cathedral in Aix-la-Chapelle, which was, of course, a symbol of Carolingian power. By depicting the cleric with his glasses in his hand, Van Eyck clearly communicated to the viewer that Van der Pale had finished his lectio and started his meditatio, following a common sequence in devotional treatises. The physical space of the altar is in his picture taken over by the Enthroned Virgin with the Christ child on her lap, alluding to the celebration of the Eucharist during Mass, since the child is similarly placed on a white sheet, like the hostia would be taken by the priest in a white sheet and presented and shown to the audience. In this painting, Jan van Eyck also depicts two saints. Saint Donation is represented as the patron of the church in Bruges, that's his function here, while Saint George appears to be as the patron saint of the kneeling donor, whom he introduces to the Virgin of Child. If you look at his left arm, this is a typical gesture that you would expect from presentation of patron saints of their namesakes. But in fact, the gesture that is executed with the right hand is rather unusual. By depicting this gesture, it seems Van Eyck intentionally aimed to invoke allusions toward one of the relics kept in the treasury of Saint Donations, namely an armor reliquary of Saint George, which must have been a prized possession. So this motive sort of like illustrates and sort of represents and embodies a relic that was actually present and venerated in the church in which the painting was hung. It's kind of a visual marker that draws people in there. The same actually is true for the, excuse me, this bad slide is being pixeled due to resolution issues. The lavishly painted audit of Donation also refers to a reliquary textile that was kept in the church believed to be the parament of Saint Donation, whereby I like to stress that it is completely irrelevant whether or not the reliquary looked anything like the robe of Van Eyck depicted, and I think perhaps it did not, but it must have been clearly understood as a visual marker for the venerated relic. The same is most likely true for the cross of the saint's hand, which clearly resembles reliquary crosses or crosses that contained pieces of relics in them. In any case, Jan van Eyck intentionally included portraits of relics which were prized possession in the churches that generated veneration and meant legitimacy of authority and power. And it is from this perspective, from this context, that we can look at Van Eyck's substantial contribution to the transformation of the Byzantine icon in the West. During the late Middle Ages, when wars of succession, threats of an invasion of the Holy Land, illnesses, and the schism of the church challenged about pretty much every aspect of life in society, ruling dynasties tried to demonstrate their legitimacy of power by amassing dynastic treasure, in which relics played a significant, if not the most significant part of legitimacy. There was a clear understanding concerning the value or power of these relics, with bodily relics, bones, etc., being more important than secondary relics, like objects that had been worn or touched. Relics of common saints or martyrs were considered less significant than those of more venerated saints like St. Catherine, Barbara, George, or the Three Magi, which, of course, were the subject of a major reliquary robbery by the city of Cologne from Milano, where they were actually first displayed. The most valuable relics were those of the Apostle, the Virgin, and Christ. Of course, both of them didn't have any bodily reliquaries available because of the assumption that took place. Of course, that is if you don't count the Holy Foreskin, which was until the early 20th century kept in Turin. Often enough, these relics had reached the West from the Holy Land in the East and continued to do so during the Gras in the 14th and early 15th century. The French kings of the Capetian dynasty possessed most prized relics, such as the crown of thorns, which were venerated in the Sainte-Chapelle in Aix-la-Chapelle in the 14th century. The choir of the cathedral emulated the chapel in Paris and contained some of the Carolingian relics of the bells of Christ and Mary, as well as Marian relics, the diaper of Jesus, and as you probably all know, the Cathedral of Trier famously housed the seamless robe of Christ. Relics and also images of relics were believed to function as mediators between the devout and the divine. They could be venerated and adored, and they could be seen and touched. They addressed the senses and gave the abstract subjects of religious veneration a physical presence, a vessel, so to say. Relics and images that have the status of relics attracted pilgrimages, are highly lucrative, busy in late medieval times, something like cruise tourism in the 21st century. And in many places, these relics and images with relic status were not only statically displayed, but presented publicly in a dynamic way sometimes even processed around during special occasions. In order to increase their spiritual and practical value, there was a competition to obtain indulgences that offered devout worshippers additional benefits in exchange for specific acts, mostly of veneration, such as prayers that had to be said in front of these images. And as Ingrid has said, and we can read by Hans Belting, there was a common, if to our mind, probably superstitious belief that the benefits of such venerated and or indulged images or relics of images, images with relic status, could pass over onto replicas of the indulged originals, which helps explain why certain images became particularly popular. And this also helps us to understand the popularity of the figure constellation of many of the Marian paintings by Jan van Eyck, which were repeated numerous times. Such was the case with the Madonna at the Fountain, of which Catherine will speak in a moment, or his Madonna at the church, now in the Gemäldegalerie in Berlin. As Catherine will demonstrate in a talk in just a minute, van Eyck transformed compositional types that were in fact traditional Byzantine icons the Flemish painter adapted and appropriated these authorities' images, which most likely were subject to a devotional veneration because of their Byzantine, Eastern, authentic origins. We have to keep in mind that if we look into a German panel that was commissioned by the abbot of the important Benedictine Abdey of St. Amaran in Ringsburg in the mid of the 15th century, from a still anonymous artist called now the Master of the Madonna of Wolfgang Strauss. The composition, and especially the configuration used for the Virgin and Child, is clearly modeled after Jan van Eyck's Lucca Madonna of 1345 around. And like others, I used to think that the Bavarian artist came across van Eyck's original or a copy thereof, and because of his recognition of the superior artistic quality, tried to emulate it. And it is true that the master was keenly aware of some of the innovations that are usually linked to the Flemish Art Nouveau, but it is also clear to the unbiased eye, not mine a couple of years ago, but probably now, that he failed to acknowledge the spatial concept of van Eyck's original and remained faithful only to the setup of the figures. This, in combination, here is the one of the models for the Lucca Madonna. The combination with the influential and well-connected tower, just to point out that even today, in this Baroque refurbishment of St. Amaran, this Madonna of Wolfgang Strauss remains one of the icons that are venerated in that space. In combination with the influential and well-connected clerical pattern, it makes it far more likely that the patron, Wolfgang Strauss, was less interested in abstract concept of artistic innovation, but in very tangible benefits for his internal soul when he commissioned that very painting following a specific composition. In at least one case, there is concrete evidence that one of the Marian paintings commissioned from Jan van Eyck was the recipient of an indulgence. In 1401, the Carthusian monk Jan Vos translocated from his Carthusian home convent in Lichtert in Utrecht to become prior of the Carthusian monastery of Genadendal in Bruges, perhaps in anticipation of this move, or perhaps instantly after his arrival in Flanders. He commissioned a small panel depicting the Virgin and Child with Saints Barbara and Elizabeth. The so-called Madonna of Jan Vos, or Frick Madonna, or because of previous owners, the Rothschild Madonna, today at the Frick Collection in New York, has recently been the star of a small exhibition in New York entitled The Charterhouse of Bruges, which added a few significant insights into the genesis of the painting, which, contrary to previous belief, still was more and more directly conceived by Jan van Eyck a few months before his death in summer of 1441. Additional information unearthed by my colleague Emma Capron, now at the National Gallery in London, shed light on the nature of the indulgence. Jan Vos was able to obtain an indulgence that promised a relief of 40 days from limbo for those who said the Hail Mary or Ave Maria in front of the painting. This was a relatively modest indulgence, but could be obtained without special bulls issued from Rome. And Jan Vos had received his indulgence from a visiting bishop from Ireland who visited the Low Countries at that period. For the bishop and any other high-ranking cleric outside of the papal administration, the maximum indulgence that could be granted was exactly 40 days. It is worthwhile to take a closer look at this fascinating painting because it clearly suggests the attentive viewer how to behave in front of the image. The cloth of honor behind the Virgin is made of a brocade decorated with floral elements. One of the motifs, reminiscent, by the way, of devices found on the reverse of noblemen's portraits connected to the armor, are two crossed or intertwined wooden branches with a banderole wrapped around it. The Israelistic embroidery suggests that these banderoles repeat the angelic phrase spoken by the Archangel Gabriel to the Virgin during the moment of the Annunciation, Ave Maria, gratia plena, hail Mary, filled with grace. The painted words use common abbreviations to the effect that the gratia of the Gra for gratia actually looks suspiciously close to the word ora, and transforming the phrase into instruction to the via, which says ora ave, or pray Hail Mary. This little visual pun, typical for the way Van Eyck sort of works out instructions and sort of make references, demonstrate that Jan Vos presumably intended from the very outset on to have a specific indulgence attached to the panel that he commissioned from Van Eyck for the chapel of the Contusion Convent and in Bruges. Let us turn to another Eyckian invention that must be understood as an intentional transformation of iconic representation of Christ from the Byzantine East. There are several versions of one or in fact two images of the Holy Face that on the end of January 1438 and around the same time in 1440. Both images, the origins of which don't survive, seem to originate in the wider context of the Economical Council of Ferrara in Florence, which lasted from January 38 until 45. This rival council was summoned on the initiative of Pope Eugene IV and had already unsuccessfully tried to dissolve the Council of Basel in 1431, only to find that this drew more clerics to an increasingly radicalized conciliar party, which eventually deplaced Eugene as Pope and elected Duke of Savoy on the throne of St. Peter, who became known as the anti-Pope Felix V in 1438, the moment that the Council of Ferrara and Florence commenced. The years following the unsuccessful dissolution of the Council of Basel in 1431, Eugene tried to get support from leading princes in Europe and to ally with the Burgundian by appointing Philip's candidates to the seats of the bishoprics in the Burgundian territories, and to send him in 1433 a famous host that was allegedly pierced by a Jew, after which it became miraculously bloodstained. This miraculous host was kept in Dijon, became a relic-like object of devotion and veneration at the ducal court until it was destroyed during the French Revolution. Eugene the IV was instrumental in brokering the Peace of Arras in 1435 between France and Burgundy, and he had used Cardinal Albergati, an experienced diplomat and Carthusian monk, as papal legate to assist negotiations between the opposing parties. Albergati was then in there portrayed by Jan van Eyck, who had specially been summoned by the dukes to travel to Bruges, from Bruges to Arras. And it was this person, Cardinal Niccolo Albergati, who opened the Council of Ferrara on January 8th of 1438, on which the Pope had successfully invited, among others, the ambassadors of several of the Orthodox Byzantine churches to actually propose to overcome the schism of Christianity to unite the Catholic Church of the Latin West with the Orthodox churches in the Byzantine East. At the same time, sort of on the 8th of January 1438, Philip had summoned the clergy in his own territories in the Low Countries to Arras in order to discuss how to end the division between the conciliar and the papal partisans. By then, Philip had already forbidden to sell indulgences issued by the council, and now openly declared his support for the Pope by dispatching high-ranking ambassadors to the Council of Ferrara in Italy. If we can trust a 17th century record of what must have been an inscription either on the lost frame of the portrait of Cardinal Albergati, now in Vienna, or information available on it, the panel, which was then in the collection of the Antwerp dealer Peter Stevens, was dated in 1438. It says sort of like the Cardinal of Santa Croce, who came to Arras to make peace between the Dukes of Burgundy, etc., etc. So it's a very specific memorial inscription or information that is linked to this object. We have the drawing in Dresden, we have the painting in Vienna. And it was, the Grande Dame Elisabeth Dallens was the first to suggest a link between this portrait and the Council of Ferrara and Florence, and even thought, although wrongly, that Jan van Eyck may have made the portrait at that time during a visit to Italy. She also suggested that the two versions of Van Eyck's Holy Face, dated in January 1438 and January 31st, 1440, were created with the unification of Christendom in mind, whereby the painter deliberately would have chosen an Eastern image and reflected thereby discussions about his participant about the very nature of God. This may or may not be true. The date recorded on the frame of the Berlin panel, which you see on your left, an early 16th century copy, clearly refers to the period of the council. The trompe-l'œil frame of the 17th century copy in the Grüne Museum Bruges, however, records the year 1440. The Eichian version, after which the prototype for this panel must have been available in 1637, when the copy was made by a local artist in Bruges. A painting on parchment by Petrus Christus may or may not reflect the same prototype to some degree, but alters the context significantly by adding the crown of thorns. Christus's face of Christ is no longer a universal portrait of Christ, which is mirroring mankind, as Belding suggested in view of Cusanus' Divisione Dei of 1453, but actually an image of the Passion. The other two panels linked to the lost Eichian prototypes are the version in Munich, which may be older than the version in Berlin, but does follow.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you just finish in 2 minutes and go to your conclusion, because we are running out of time? Sorry.
Sure. I'll almost done. Yeah. But of course, now I lost my thread here. Munich, which may be older than the version of Berlin, but does follow the facial feature of the Eichian original less faithfully, and a panel formerly in Newcastle upon Tyne, which I nor anybody I know has ever seen in the flesh. It is clear that the panels in Munich and Berlin are linked to each other by the similar inscription on the frame, and that the panel formerly in England is related to the copy in Bruges, as becomes clear by looking at the jewels of the theme of the Christ's dress. The prototype of both images was clearly linked to the ambivalent depiction of the deity of the Ghent altarpiece, which may have been Van Eyck's first attempt to render the face of Christ as a portrait of a human being. However, the deity of the Ghent altarpiece fulfills a specific function in the context of intercession, and therefore is depicted by the painter with his ears, who would listen to what Mary and the Baptist would have to say, which are both shown with open lips. This aspect is clearly not part of the iconic portraits of Christ that Van Eyck invented. Here is two of the inscriptions recorded in the frame. The Bruges copy records a quote from the Psalms, Speciosus forma prae filiis hominum, you are beautiful above the sons of men, referring possibly to the final words of the apocryphal Lentulus letter, which in Van Eyck's time was considered an authentic description of Jesus. And now I'm coming to my conclusion. As Manuel Bernarda Lopez And Jesus Folgado Gracia have recently pointed out another aspect should be considered in the context of the icon face of Christ and its possible link to the council in Ferrara. The Holy Shroud had been kept in Liry, south of Troyes, and thereby in Burgundian territory for about 100 years from the mid-14th century until 1453, when it became into the possession of the Dukes of Savoy in Chambéry and later Turin. And just show you here the original display in Turin. Already at the end of the 14th century, the authenticity of the shroud had been officially doubted by the lords of, but the lords of Czerny, the owners, were granted the right to display the textile as long as it was not venerated as a relic, nor presented as a textile in which dead Christ was covered. While Philip the Good didn't own the shroud, the Lord of Czerny was among his closest allies in Burgundy, and the Duke involved himself in safeguarding it. It certainly a possibility that Philip realized that by officially joining the obedience of Eugene IV, he might persuade the Pope as well as the participants of the council in Ferrara to authenticate the shroud and thereby increasing the legitimacy of his own power and elevate them in terms of ownership of reliquaries toward the ranks of other knights and emperors. And it seems not all impossible that the Duke commissioned his court painter, absent in the documents in Bruges following the uprising of the city in 1437, to create a venerable image of the shroud to help promoting the cult. Having Van Eyck inventing and completing the image would have certainly appealed to Eugene's trusted advisor Cardinal Albergati, who it seems not only was interested in the art, he visited the newly altarpiece by Jacques Daré, which was commissioned by Jean de Clercq when he was in Arras in 1435, but also seems to have maintained close relationship with the painter, as Henry Calavir will show in a forthcoming article. The pictorial source of Van Eyck remains unclear, but it is more than unlikely that this portrait of Christ was based on his encounter with the Holy Shroud alone. We may have to assume that Van Eyck had already encountered Byzantine icons while he was working on the Ghent altarpiece, either mediated by imported icons of Italo-Byzantine origins or by first-hand experience of those icons in Italy or further east. With the strong presence of Venetian and Genoese merchant bankers in Bruges, who may have owned such exotic images, but also with icons at Van Eyck's time were venerated in Flanders, both possibilities seem equally likely. It is clear that ultimately the Duke of Burgundy seems to have succeeded his ambition as the veneration of the Holy Shroud began from the moment that this ownership passed from the lords of Czerny to the Dukes of Savoy. Meanwhile, Van Eyck's image of the Holy Face, whatever its sources, became the authoritative prototype for all future portraits of Christ, which began to circulate in the Low Countries as well in the Holy Roman Empire, in Spain, in the medium of panel painting, as well as manuscripts with iconographic alterations that would like the image to the idea of the sacrificial death of Christ, resurrection from the dead, and at least that for at least a century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tel, for this very rich and interesting paper on Jan van Eyck's art and for putting this fascinating production in its artistic, cultural, and also political context. I received a message from Catherine Lichtert, who is going to speak now, and she suggested that we gather the question for your paper and her together because there are some links between them, and she's also going to speak about Jan van Eyck. So is it okay for you if we gather the questions for you after her talk? Okay, great. And so for the audience, if you already have questions for Tel-Holger Borchardt, you can ask them using the Q&R tool. And so we can start to look at them right now. Thank you. So I'm going to introduce now our second speaker, Catherine Lichtert. She's also an art historian. She studied at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels, where she obtained a master's degree in art history with a thesis on the influence of Byzantine icons on Netherlandish painting. And then from 2007 onward, she worked at Ghent University on an interdisciplinary project focusing on representation of cities in the Southern Low Countries, and she obtained her PhD there in 2014 with a dissertation on Peter Bruegel the Elder and the representation of urban landscapes. In 2015, she founded Ludens Art Projects, whose ambition is to make art and art historical knowledge accessible for everyone who wants to engage with it. And so also to enjoy and learn about art. In 2018, she created the overview exhibition Adriaan Brouwer, Master of Emotion in Oudenaarde. And she currently works as an independent curator and researcher on different projects, such as the exhibition about Albrecht Dürer held by BOZAR during the fall 2021. So, Catherine, the floor is for you now. Thanks.
So good morning to all of you. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, Ralph de Koning and also Ingrid Valk, and also BOZAR for this kind invitation. So this presentation is about the influence of Byzantine icons on the Flemish primitives, on early Netherlandish paintings. And like Ingrid said, it's based on my master's thesis, which I completed a very long time ago at the Free University Brussels. So in what follows, I will provide a general introduction on the Eleusa. It's the mother god of tenderness. And I will go more into detail about the precise circumstances and also the way in which these influences manifested themselves. And we will focus more specifically on Jan van Eyck's famous Madonna at the Fountain as a case study. So during the 15th and early 16th centuries, images of the Virgin and Child were among the most common devotional artifacts in the Burgundian Netherlands. Just as devotional texts encourage the devotee to imagine and experience the events described, such andachtsbeelden served the same purpose, offering the spectator to empathize and identify with the characters depicted. Most of these compositions are contemporary interpretations of Eastern or Italo-Byzantine prototypes, influenced by cult images often present on Netherlandish soil, adapted to then prevailing styles and certain devotional practices. So sometimes this assimilation is so thorough that the link to the original prototypes has virtually been lost. So here you see a praying man by Petrus Christus, and you see the prayer hanging in the back of the painting on the wall, and it includes a small icon which refers to the holy face that Till was talking about earlier. So I will just give an overview of the different iconographical types before zooming into the Mother God of Tenderness. So the main iconographic types of Byzantine imagery that the main categories in early Netherlandish painting based on Byzantine imagery. That's actually what it should be. So first of all, we have the Virgin, we have the Madonna and Child as a first type, and then the single Virgin. And then of course we have the Christ images, we have the Man of Sorrow, and then a third category is the Holy Face, where we have the Salvator Mundi and also the Vera icon. So if we focus on the images of the Madonna and Child, we distinguish four main iconographic types. The first one is the Byzantine Madonna Galactatrophusa, or the Western Virgo Lactans. So it's a virgin with child in her arms while she nurses Jesus. He's lying in her arms or standing on her lap, while they often look at each other. Second one is the Madonna Rodriguia, which literally means she who knows the way, who shows the way. The Virgin holds the Christ child at her side while pointing at him as a source of salvation of mankind. Then the third one is the Madonna Nicopoia, which means she who brings victory, and it's the enthroned Virgin with Christ child sitting or standing on her lap. She is embracing the child with both arms, and characteristically, both figures are represented in a frontal and a rather static way. So it's a bit stiff. And then the fourth one is, of course, the Madonna Eleusa, the Mother God of Tenderness, which is characterized by the intimate and affectionate relationship between mother and son. And here we see one of the most famous examples of the Madonna Eleusa, of course, the Vladimirskaya. which is an in origin Byzantine icon created at the beginning of the 12th century, one of the most famous, I guess, and also one of the most venerated Orthodox icons. So traditionally, the Virgin is represented both in half length and in full length, sitting or standing, and the Christ child is either placed on the right or the left hand side. So there are different variations. In general, the child's body is turned towards his mother, and both figures are in an affectionate and warm embrace. The emphasis on the human character of both figures can be traced to certain doctrinal points advanced by the iconodels during the iconoclastic period in the 8th century. So a second important feature of the Eleusa is Mary's apparently sorrowful glance, which is directed into the distance. It refers to her foreseeing of Christ's destiny and the events to come which will lead to his death and resurrection. So the Virgin's expression is similar to the ones encountered in representations of the Lamentation or Descent from the Cross. So this double-layered iconography is actually crucial to the Eleusa, so the close connection of the mother and son, the affection between both figures, and then the mother foreseeing her son's destiny, which brings her sorrow and sadness. Eleusa literally means the compassionate one, so referring to the compassion of the Mother of God towards her son. And unlike other Byzantine types, such as the Hodegetria, we cannot relate the title of the Eleusa to one specific prototype. So there are several variations of the Eleusa. It is often equated with the Madonna Glycophilusa. And here we see a wonderful example, a Byzantine example, and then one of the most beautiful depictions of the Eleusa, Glycophilusa, in early Netherlandish painting by Dirk Bouts. So the Glycophilusa means the loving one. So in this case, the affection between mother and God is even more emphasized by their loving embrace and the touching of their lips. So basically, it's Mary and Jesus kissing. So then briefly, I will just show you three other variants of the Eleusa. They're not that much of importance, except for the first one. So the differences in the variants are mainly explained. As you can see, the Christ child is often a bit awkward. The positions of the arm also not very natural. On the left-hand side, we see the Pelagonetissa. Characteristic here is, of course, the awkward position of the Christ child who turns his body towards the Virgin, meanwhile turning his head and glance towards the viewer. So both arms are juxtaposed, and the lively posture of the child is contrasted with the seemingly motionless pose of the Virgin. So it's a playful child. Then in the center, we see a Kykotissa, which is a variant from Cyprus. So also with a twisted body, but some different details. And then the third one is the Cardiotissa, which is a variant from Crete, so Cretan variant. So the origins of the Eleusa, I will say something very briefly about it. It's this image is actually the oldest known version of a Madonna Eleusa, and it's a Coptic sculpture, which nowadays is in the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore. It should be Syrian or Egyptian, or it goes back to an Egyptian prototype, possibly a copy of an icon. And this seems very plausible, seeing the general importance of Egypt in the development of Christian iconography. So it was definitely one of the most popular images of the Virgin and Child, so the Eleusa, I mean, in general, in the Byzantine Empire, and from the 12th century onwards, it was assimilated into European visual culture. From that period onwards, we discern depictions of the Eleusa in Italy, France, England, Germany, and first introduced in illuminated manuscripts, like this example is 12th century, the 12th century, yes. And later on in all sorts of media, such as painting, sculpture, prints, and stained glass. In the Low Countries, the Mother God of Tenderness was particularly popular during the second half of the 15th and the early 16th centuries, and many early Netherlandish paintings intended for private devotion still attest to that popularity. The most famous example of an Italo-Byzantine icon depicting the Eleusa, important in the southern Netherlands, and Ingrid already referred to it, is of course the Notre de Gras, the icon of Cambrai, which was an in origin Siamese image said to be painted by Saint Luke, of course, and it was imported in the Low Countries in 1440. So this image had a very, very important influence on the popularization of several images of the Mother God of Tenderness. Also van der Weyden, we also saw this magnificent jewel-like Eleusa before in Ingrid's introduction. Van der Weyden played a very important role in the popularization of the Madonna Eleusa in the early, well, in the Low Countries. So this vogue for the Mother God of Tenderness is due to different aspects that can be related to the context of private devotion. First of all, there was an immense veneration towards the Virgin Mary. It's, well, if you look at cities like Antwerp and Brussels, Antwerp and Bruges, I'm sorry, Brussels also, but Bruges more than Brussels, as very important urban centers where the devotion towards the Virgin was promoted, and it's still visible in all the landmarks in the public space, of course. And secondly, there was also a shift in practices of private devotion, influenced by the Devotio Moderna and other religious movements, and that certainly enhanced the popularity of these images. And then a third aspect is, of course, the presence of cult images such as the Madonna de Cambrai, which further enhanced the popularity of this type of imagery. But the earliest known representation of a Mother God of Tenderness in early Netherlands painting is indeed Jan van Eyck's Madonna at the Fountain, a splendid and well-preserved jewel-like small panel, which is clearly intended for private devotion. To give you an idea about the measurements, it's 19 on 12, so it's really like a jewel-like, very small panel. It's part of the collection of the Royal Museum of Fine Arts of Antwerp, but it's currently on display in Meijer van den Berg, I think. So Van Eyck painted the picture in 1439, and from a typological point of view, it's clearly inspired by a Byzantine Madonna Pelagonitissa. So here we see I included this image because it's on display here in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It's a picture from the end of 2019 when we were still able to travel, and the Madonna also traveled a lot the last years, but I included the presentation because I really like the way it was displayed in the room. It's really like a jewel-like presentation, and you see the small scale of the panel also. So it's a very intimate, an intimate scenography. Let's put it like that. So. And here we see the full panel, of course, with the frame. So the original frame is designed and painted as a kind of trompe-l'œil, as it was carved from marble. The lower borders features, of course, the artist's motto, als ik kan, as best I can, in Greek letters. We see the Virgin, that she is placed before a precious cloth of honor, which draped over a small bench-like stone wall. The verdant garden, and here we see some details. So the so-called Hortus Conclusus with lush vegetation refers to medieval religious texts describing the Virgin as a garden and the spring of gardens, both the garden and the fountain referring to her role, of course, in producing and sustaining life. An important source for this kind of marial symbolism is the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament, often referred to also as the most erotic biblical text. And it's Rupert of Deutz who was the first to give the Song of Songs a fundamentally Marian interpretation concerning the love union between God and humankind in the incarnation of Christ through the Virgin Mary. Afterwards, Bernardus of Clairvaux elucidated the Song of Songs in his sermons as an allegory in which the Virgin was identified with the bride and Jesus with the heavenly bridegroom. So the roses in the background are also marial symbols, references that we can also find references of those in medieval love poetry. And then in his left hand, Christ child is holding prayer beads, a gift often presented by the bridegroom as a sign of respect and trust to his bride. Unfortunately, we do not know the specific prototype on which Van Eyck's Madonna was based, but I will give a concise overview of possible ways how Van Eyck could have encountered such Byzantine or Byzantinizing representations of the Mother of God. So from 1425 on, Van Eyck was in the service of Duke Philip the Good as a court painter. And here we see Philip the Good. We know that Philip owned several icons or icon-like paintings referred to in the inventory as à la façon Gras or d'ancienne façon. Among them were several images of the Virgin and Child. It is very likely that, that Van Eyck had access, of course, as his peintre et valet de chambre to Philip's private collection, and that he encountered the diverse Byzantine icons in this manner. Another option is that Van Eyck learned to know such icons during one of his many journeys he also made for Philip. Several business trips are documented, such as a pilgrimage in 1426, which he had made en lieu of the Duke, a secret mission to faraway lands in the same year, several secret trips, and of course a visit to Portugal, where within the context of Philip's approaching wedding with Isabella of Portugal in 1428-29. In 1435, he traveled to the peace conference in Arras, still also referred to that, at the request of the Duke, in order to portray the participants. And in 1436, he again undertakes a faraway trip to foreign lands in order to deal with secret circumstances. So that's all very fluish. It has also been suggested, also like Till pointed out earlier, that Van Eyck was part of the diplomatic mission sent by Philip to attend the Council of Ferrara-Florence in 1438 and 39. During this ecumenic council, images of the Virgin and Child fulfilled an important role, and they were exchanged as gifts, since the veneration of the Mother of God was the main common factor between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church. So this common ground between East and West, the fervent devotion of the Virgin Mary, was a major factor in also the production of devotional images, both in East and West. Then another, or possibly an additional source for Van Eyck's Madonna at the Fountain is to be found in a miraculous event which took place in 1403 when Philip the Bold, the grandfather of Philip the Good, was securing the coast at Duinkerke. A small statue of the Virgin was discovered by a fountain or source of water and was therefore associated with this event. The statue was called Our Lady of the Fountain or Our Lady of the Dunes. And then another possibility, which was pointed out by Marion Ainsworth, she mentions a possible Cretan prototype. Oops, yeah, voilà. As a possible prototype for Van Eyck's modern icon, the export of icons from Crete to the Netherlands is well documented, and Ainsworth suggested that Van Eyck might have found inspiration in a depiction of the Virgin Kikotissa, so it's a variant of the Madonna Eleusa, which is similar to the one preserved in the Louvre, which you see on the slide. And of course, it is true that there is the general composition and formal characteristics, they are similar or they resemble, but then again, there are also iconographic differences. So I don't think that's very likely. It is plausible, though, that Van Eyck's painting was inspired by one of the many miracle-working images in Bruges, more specifically linked to the Cathedral Charter House, also mentioned by Till before, located just outside the city walls of Bruges, since later copies appear to make reference to this location. So the link with Bruges is very evident if we take a look at the several copies from the second half of the 15th and especially the early 16th century. Most of them originated in Bruges in the circle of Gerard David and Adriaan Isenbrand. David was a leading painter in Bruges at that time and the most important follower of Van Eyck's legacy. So we will focus on this specific painting and David's. First of all of these copies confirm the cult status of Van Eyck's image. And if we look specifically to the Virgin and Child with 4 angels of David, and now in the Metropolitan, he retakes his predecessor's well-known Virgin and Child, but he actually modernized the composition by placing the figures in a grand arched porch, flanked by columns with Italianate capitals and against a backdrop of contemporary Bruges. An interesting and telling detail is the strolling and reading Carthusian monk in the enclosed garden, so actually the area just outside the Bruges city walls, suggesting that the painting indeed refers to the former monastery of Genadedal, located just outside the city wall of Bruges. So it's very interesting, the actualization of the Hortus Conclusus and the city walls of the city of Bruges. David based the painting on a drawing he made after Van Eyck's famous Madonna. The painter most probably had a commission for the Virgin and Child with 4 angels, which prompted him to study and render the figures of the Virgin and Child very, very precisely. So the copies, the several versions actually of this painting and of the composition in Bruges suggest that this particular image was not only popular, but probably a locally revered image of the Eleusa, or at least a votive image of some considerable fame. In that respect, David modernized Van Eyck's iconic image and provided a new context in order to bring it up as a living icon, linked to the Carthusian monastery of Genadedal. So to conclude, it's a rather concise overview, but at least you have an insight in the possible sources of Van Eyck's Madonna at the Fountain and the way this kind of motif persisted. And it becomes clear that the processes of assimilation and transformation of specific iconographic types of Byzantine origin, such as the Eleusa in Van Eyck's Madonna at the Fountain, is a rather complex and not always well-known process. So artists rarely copied Byzantine icons exactly, but instead they adapted the composition to the then prevailing style, iconographic traditions, and specific devotional practices. So sometimes the assimilation process is so thorough that the link to these Eastern images, iconic images, has virtually been lost. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine, for this very interesting overview, which completes very well, I think, till presentation right before yours. So we will now go through the questions. So if you haven't already, you can write your question in the Q&A tool, and I will just check. There is one question from Caroline Morrison, which was addressed, I think, to Till. So she says, I did not quite catch what you said about Christ and beauty. Could you please repeat the honorific title with regard to Christ in relation to beauty and the source? Thank you.
I don't think I said anything about Christ and beauty. That's why I didn't answer.
Okay. So maybe Caroline Morrison, can you just precise what you were referring to, or just if you had another comment? I have on my side one question for Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, do you have an idea of why Jan van Eyck chose to have the full-length representation of the Virgin for the Virgin and Child, taking into account the predominance of half-length representation of the Virgin in early Netherlandish painting and the close relation, of course, to Byzantine icons. Do you have an idea why Van Eyck chose a full-length representation of the Virgin? Because it's not that usual in... Yeah, I see Till.
Yeah.
I think the half-length compositions of the Virgin and Child and the typical icon-like presence, they are much more common, I think, also after Cambrai arrives, concerning the Eleusa, of course. So that's from 1440 onwards. And like I also said, I think Van Eyck also probably based himself or was inspired by some kind of possibly the statue or something else. And it's not that they were that uncommon actually, but I guess the half-length iconic representations are more well known, especially the Van der Weydes and the Dirk Boutsen and Christussen and based on Cambrai. So I think that might be a possible explanation. I don't know if Till has something
Well, I'm
to
just
add?
thinking about the fact that I think the idea of the early character. I mean, there is not one single representation by Van Eyck where it's half length. Everyone is full length, and the same goes with degrees, with the exception of a painting that used to be in the Benting Thyssen collection, is now in Antwerp. The Petrus Christus. Petrus Christus's Madonnas are also kind of more or less full length, if I'm not entirely mistaken. So it seems to be something which, which seemed to be the norm in a way, and it is a more, if you want to, it's a more profound transformation. It's not really that Van Eyck copies an icon. He is he's appropriating it. He's sort of making the scheme his own. And he seems to be keenly aware of certain qualities that, okay, I get the quality that made it a venerable image. Yeah? So, it has to do, I think, very much with the idea of embodiment as well. It's sort of like, as I tried to say, if you have a depiction, but the depiction is also a reference to reality. It's sort of like it's a very complex process where the image and reality and the power of the image are sort of like constantly intertwining.
Yeah, maybe if I can add something to that.
Yes, of course.
Well, I was thinking also, because we probably think too much of icons present in the Low Countries, like small scale panels. But if you think more about depictions of the Virgin and Child in churches, sculptures, typically Byzantine, they are also often full length. The mosaics, so it's maybe also that's also something we don't have to forget, like the traveling and seeing things abroad. And not only the mobile objects, the mobility of these kind of icons in the Low Countries. So there are several sources.
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Caroline Morrison added a comment about her question. So I'm reading. You said something in relation to an inscription on the Holy Face about Gras as the beautiful one. Till, so do you see more clearly what she's referring to?
Yes, I do. I was just trying to answer, but somehow I didn't take it. So it's actually on the frame of the Bruges copy. And let me just try if I can share the screen. Just one second.
I see that you replied.
Yeah. So here you have this inscription which reads "Speciosus forma praefilis hominum," and that is a reference to a piece of the Psalms, and also the last sentence in the so-called Lentulus letter. It says, "You are beautiful." The Lentulus letter is a description of the characteristic of Christ, and the last sentence in English is, "You are beautiful above the sons of men." Speciosus forma praefilis hominum. And that's what is actually written on the inscription of the Bruges copy, which is a copy from 1634. That copies, it's a flat painting, it copies also the frame. It's not a frame, it's a painted frame.
Okay, thank you. We have 3 minutes left. So there's another question from Marco Bertolini, which is addressed to both of you, I think. So he has a question about the circulation of the works. Some years or decades ago, scholars focused more on local production and characteristics. Today, we recognize that people and works were not static and anchored in one territory, but that they were circulating, that ideas, culture, and people were constantly moving and exchanging a lot. Did globalization also affect the academic world in that new kind of view? So that's a very broad question, maybe addressed to everyone. Yes, of course. And so I don't know if you have a comment to that.
I think what is maybe interesting in this respect is the gift culture of these kind of objects, and especially linked to the specific, if we talk about Van Eyck, linked to the specific councils in that time, the Ferrare Florence, and also him traveling to Arras. And I think that accounts also to other early Netherlandish painters and artists. Yeah, and also if you think about the copies of the Cambrai Madonna, they are also related, or it's at least it's a hypothesis to the Philips the Good, his plans to organize a crusade, and as a sort of exchange gift for noble people. I think that's a very important aspect of the circulation of these kind of objects, or the mobility of these objects, so the gift culture. I don't know if somebody wants to add something to that.
Well, I mean, essentially, I think, yes, you're right. You know, decades, how to say that, you know, there is still an ongoing, you know, discussion about Northern Netherlandish and Southern Netherlandish manuscript in the 15th century, which is complete bullshit. I mean, you know, we are tending to think, or we used to tend to think within national lines, which made people experts from Northern painting or Italian painting or Spanish painting, etc., etc. But we have to understand that this, you know, in a very different way than today, but it's still a global economy with things exchanging constantly. You know, if you look today at more recent medieval studies, you'll see that contrary to 10, even 5 years ago, you find much more information about Islamic art than before, because it is part of the equation, and you can't look at Mediterranean culture with sort of like keeping this out of the equation. You have to understand this is part of our European legacy, and from that point of view, yes, we do have a more global. We do realize that people traveled much more than you know, basically, you know, 10 years ago, everyone thought, you know, there's an artist, and if he moves from his door to the next village, you know, that, you know, if you don't have a record of that, that didn't happen. Of course it did happen, you know. People moved from Bamberg to Nuremberg, from Frankfurt to Leipzig, from Krakow to Nuremberg. You know, they were, I wouldn't say they were on the road all the time, but there were an extremely many people on the road, a lot. And just, you know, just for the record, and we do have records of that. Just look at the data that is available from the Brenner Pass in the 15th and 16th century about how many people actually crossed forth and back in the Alps. It's incredible.
Yes, thank you. We have two other questions, and these will be the two last ones. So one from Nicolas Van Est. Could you tell me some more about the cloister of Genadendal in Bruges? They were Carthusian monks, so normally they didn't have contact with people. Or it is possible that this may have been such influence.
Till, go ahead.
Well,
you're the expert.
I'm not the expert on Carthusians.
No, but on Van Eyck.
They were kind of shaven often enough, and they had also a confraternity. But, and I think that is something that somebody well known to us both, Jan Dumoulin has brought to the equation, is that the Carthusian monasteries were important in that they attracted a kind of patronage from lay people, you know, and a very high-end type. So in Bruges, for example, all the really important and rich families made donations to the Carthusians. So you find the Adornis, you find the Banst family, etc., etc. Pretty much the same happens in Ghent with the Carthusians there. And do remember that when Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, is trying to build a kind of funerary site, whom does he ask? He sort of like gets a couple of Carthusian monks to build the Carthusian monastery at Dijon and you know, Champmol. So it's I don't know. I say Opus Dei, but it's probably a little bit, it's a cynical comment, but very, very important and exposed, I think, more than other congregations at the period to high-end art as part of high-end patronage.
If I can add something to that? Because
you have been working on that too, of course. Yeah.
On Carthusians too. Of course, Carthusians monks were supposed to live in. Carthusian monastery was a desert, and it was away from the world. But in the late Middle Ages, Carthusian monasteries are built closer to cities, and the links with the laity and member of the nobility is stronger than before, because Carthusians were considered as a spiritual elite because there were contemplative monks, and so people from the nobility were asking for them their devotion and prayers, and so the links between the Carthusians and the nobility and members of the laity is getting stronger and closer in the 14th, 15th century. At this time, we are talking about chartreuses princières, so princely charter houses, because they have the patronage of members of the high nobility. So this is a phenomenon typical of the late Middle Ages for the Carthusians, to have closer and closer, more and more contacts with laity, despite the fact that they live in seclusion. And there is one, I don't know if we have time, there's one last question, so maybe we can reply quickly. It's from Charlotte Wittemer, so who thanks you both for your wonderful paper. And there's a question for Catherine. Your analysis of Van Eyck's possible access to Byzantine icons made me wonder about the more general access of these paintings in European churches in the first half of the 15th century. In addition to the famous example you mentioned, are there other examples known? And if so, do we know anything about the way they could have been accessed and viewed?
So referring to the Cambrai icon, I know there were several actually in the Low Countries, but not specifically. So several depictions of the Virgin and Child, and Christ, of course, also. But one famous example was in Liège, in the Cathedral of Saint Lambert. It's a Heilige Tria, and it's a very interesting mix between a Byzantine icon and a northern interpretation. Also, it's mixed media, if I recall well, so that's a very interesting one. And of course, there must have been a lot of others, but I can't recall all of them at this specific point in time. But I think, yeah, most of them were accessible, I guess, if they were hung in churches.
Okay, thank you very much. So we have now a break. It was supposed to be 13 minutes, but since we are a bit late, I suggest that we come back here in 15 minutes so we can have a small break, take some fresh air, and we see you again in 15 minutes. Thank you.